Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight Over Nature's View, a 2030 climate journey story. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki. Today's drop will be from Nairobi out to Dakar, Senegal, and all the way my beloved Africa. I hope you enjoy this climate journey story. Seatbelts on and wheels up. My co-pilot today is a really good friend of mine, and P.S. I am going to reveal your secrets if you dare release mine. So, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us your name, where you're from, what you're currently doing, and what you're currently into?
Who said I had secrets? Hi everyone, my name is Aisha Zakari. I am from Niamey, Niger, and I currently live in Dakar, Senegal. I travel quite a bit, and I am currently a student at a university learning computer science. I'm also on board as an ambassador and team coach for partnering with a company called FRTN Technologies. We help teams of prospective entrepreneurs who want to create startups. And this is all being done in Africa. So I'm definitely helping our ecosystem thrive. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's who she is, Sanzo. But before we go on, I'd like to bust some myths about Africa that I think need to be said more often as much as they have been said. Maybe in an African context, it looks more of a cliche, but they will be repeated until everyone else understands them. Are you ready for the pass it on?
Absolutely.
Okay, number one, Africa is a continent and not a country. Go.
My myth is that I want to let people know that we don't really know every single African that's in the continent. We barely even know much about each other. Although I wish we did, but I don't know every single person within the continent, and we're not all like blood related.
Right. Oh my days. I never thought people thought we're blood related. Anyway, my second myth is Africa is not all about savannas and Hakuna Matata.
Africa has no history. That's what people say. And
that's a myth.
Completely not true at all. We have a rich history.
All right. Number 3, there's no language called the African language. We have the African language, Afrikaans language, but not the African language. We don't speak the same language from top to bottom. Go.
Africa is lacking innovation. We have a lot of innovators, and a lot of our innovators are actually creating some of the biggest technologies, and also, even if it's not technology, but any type of innovation in any form, we have our people within the continent and in the diaspora contributing to world innovation.
Okay, number 4, Africa is not that big. It is. It's a whole continent. Please, when you say you're coming to Africa, you can't finish. Okay, you can, but Africa is a continent and it's big. That's the myth. Okay, it's not big. That's the myth.
Another one is that Africa is dangerous. That's a myth. Honestly, traveling a lot, I realized that I felt a little bit safer in some senses. I won't say that it's not it's 100% safe, but I felt a lot safer in the sense that I know that someone isn't going to just shoot me out of nowhere walking outside. That's the last thing on my mind when we came here, and I really appreciate that, actually.
Okay, not you hinting hints, but anyway. Number 5, you can only do safaris in Africa. That's untrue. There's beaches, there's lagoons, there's deserts. Like, you can have a whole Dubai desert experience in Africa. In Kenya, there's islands and archipelagos. There's everything. It's just not about savannas and safaris. There's much more.
Mine is that how people believe that Africa is not diverse. We are very diverse, and you will find even within just one small country, you'll have like over 10 different ethnic groups who have their own cultures, their own mindsets. Yes, we have a lot in common, but then we also have a lot of differences as well. And I believe that's what makes us really beautiful. But the fact that most people will think that everybody eats fufu or or something like that. Here, we may have our own different variations, but we are very diverse.
Okay. Finally, on my side, on busting the myths, myth in the bust. Africa's weather is always hot. That's not true. It gets to like negatives as well, especially in North, the MENA region, which also covers a lot of the northern countries, northern African countries. And getting now into the subject matter of this podcast being closely tied to the climate field, it's not always hot. Maybe a bit of West Africa is not too badly warm. In Kenya specifically, if I may give it context, we have quote unquote winter months in June, July, and for a long time it's been around 15 degrees, 12 degrees is super cold for us, which is quite the irony. But recently, I think in the past 3 or 4 years, our temperatures have been getting than half of that. So it's about 7 degrees, sometimes getting to 3 degrees. So it's not always hot in Africa. And this is why we're going to switch into our main agenda of climate change. And more specifically, in the context of culture, Africa has a lot of culture and biodiversity. Not only that, I think most populations here are indigenous. So this is going to be how we will try to counteract climate change, the effects of climate change and the climate crisis and ecological crisis with culture, and more specifically African culture, because it's arguably the most diverse, because I'm biased like that. So Aisha, would you first of all try to make a cross section on how culture is affected by climate change, or just generally, when you think about culture and climate change, what comes to your mind?
When I think about culture and climate change in terms like in an African context, I feel like we're overlooked a lot in the international field when it comes to that. And that is a negative thing for the rest of the world, because the way our culture intersects with the way we as Africans deal with our environment is is very beneficial, and people could learn from that. Yes, there are problems. However, I believe that the fact that we all most I would say most of us in Africa encourage harmony between humans and the environment. So you'll see we have to take care of our environment, take care of the trees. Almost every house in Niger has about like 2 or 3 trees, and these are not just trees, for for the sightseeing. They're trees that produce fruits and vegetables, and these fruits are eaten every season or even given away. We also have the culture of conserving our environment. So our indigenous communities play a huge role in combating climate change by conserving our environment, our environmental resources, and the land and our territories. Something really interesting is that I learned through my dad, some of my dad's work. A lot of the things that he does is go to rural areas and make sure that women, children, everybody is able to cultivate crops in the most environmental friendly way. And not only that, but also in a way that would benefit their neighbors and everyone else. For example, the Moringa project that we did, this is not something that I came up with. This is something that my dad also used to do. So you can create soaps with them. You can create anything, food. It's called like the tree of life in some countries. Another thing about how our culture, I'm going to talk about something a little bit negative. Our mindset when it comes to these things. I remember a couple of years back during my teenage years, I remember reading a book about climate and the relationship between climate change and African countries. And I remember reading a sentence about how my country was one of the most polluted countries out there. And I was furious about that, and I decided to voluntarily go to school and do like a project and a presentation about climate change and how, throwing away plastic bags and trash, or, those water sachets, throwing those away is impacting us in a horrible way. And the funniest part of that was when I confidently gave my presentation, everyone in the class started laughing at me. They're like, who has time for that? Who cares for that? And I said that this is really an unfortunate thing for a lot of our people to think that way. I understand that in a lot of our societies, people say, oh, we should be running after degrees, running after, different kinds of accolades that we can collect uh, in a societal stance. And we often forget about how we're impacting our climate. And the mindset of, like, not caring about that is a part of the problem. I did say something back to them, which kind of humbled them. I'm not going to say it out loud,
Okay.
but in the end, they agreed, and that's the positive thing about Africans. Once we sensibilize each other about these things in the correct way, everybody's eager to do it. I remember carrying out these presentations each week, and we were always cleaning up trash within our community every Friday. And those are a few of the spectacular things that we as Africans do. There's a sense of togetherness when it comes to this, and I believe togetherness is what we as human beings on earth need, especially in order to combat climate change. And I believe Africans should be at the forefront of this, because we have not completely, industrialized the way some other continents have, and we're able to learn the from the mistakes that they've made. So a lot of the innovations that they made back then caused a lot of the problems we're having with our climate today. So we can take a look in history and see, okay, now that we as Africans are starting to develop more within our continent, how can we implement uh, how can we implement technology? How can we build and develop ourselves in a way that's not going to hurt our environment? And the way we do it would set the standard for the rest of the world.
Harmony between the environment is our way of life, and how culture, let me say, intersects with climate change is through conservation mostly. Conservation being part of our, way to day to day life, which is culture. So coming out to be more of like the triple C's: culture, climate change equals I don't know, it's done through conservation or something like that. But now, as we know that, as much as you started touching a bit on some of the issues we need to look into, could you talk about, in terms of culture, still in the context of that, how the problems that are being faced, or how this, I don't know, climate change is inhibiting the conservation of our environment, or what are the problems that are seen when we draw this triangle of culture, climate change, and conservation? What are the problems that are seen when it comes to that?
Firstly, one of the problems, and one of the biggest problems, is food insecurity. Because of climate change and a lot of the issues pertaining to that, it's impacting our food systems in Africa a lot. So not just with cultivation of crops, but also with how the environment does that, how the environment impacts that. And one thing about us Africans is that we're more agricultural compared to other continents, and we heavily rely on agriculture. And climate change is set to impact agriculture on a huge scale, and that's hurting us Africans a lot already. In many places, you're seeing droughts never seen before happening long term in East African countries, such as, I believe, is it Ethiopia and Somalia. We're having hunger crisis going on. We're having cultivation issues. We're seeing that our old practices that were beneficial to us before are not as beneficial anymore, because things have changed, and that's one huge problem. I see another problem is the fact that a lot of the we didn't really trigger most of these problems when it comes to climate change. This came from other continents mostly. However, we are the ones who are going to be suffering from it the most. This is what I read recently. And how we're able to combat that is through awareness. And the fact that I believe most of us are really not that aware of the issue, while it's going to impact us the most compared to everyone else, is really alarming. Also, when I said the food crisis, there are some solutions.
Agriculture and food, which is basically a big informer of culture. I think your food really is from your culture. I don't know how it is maybe in the westernized world where it's just a lot of fast food, which is also turning out, I guess, to be their culture. But in Africa, our food is our essence and our culture. And maybe we'll talk about food going towards the end because Aisha doubles up as a food expert. But so in these problems, agriculture and food, and us not being the biggest producers, yet are the ones mostly harmed by climate change, and our culture is being impacted severely due to this. What are some few propositions to these problems in case, someone wants to listen? This is to the policymakers or to the biggies or individuals who want to act. What are some propositions that can be used to safeguard our food security? Although we already did an episode on food security and climate change, but now in the African context, what are some of the things that we can do to preserve our food or agriculture, which doubles up as well as our culture?
I believe one thing that we could use, some of the things that we could use, starting with utilizing indigenous knowledge.
Right.
Our indigenous knowledge is extremely rich when it comes to these things, and I believe that it could solve a lot of our problems. And the fact that most of our leaders, African leaders, are not even at the policy making table. We don't really have like an extremely strong voice when it comes to having a say with these things. So, for example, the Paris Act Agreement, we are all, most of our African countries are a part of that treaty, right? However, when it comes to bringing something to the table, bringing our own expertise, talking about solutions that we can provide from an African context, that is severely lacking on the table right now. Whereas the other countries are, having more of a say in these things. So, for example, our indigenous and local communities in Africa have utilized their knowledge and systems to respond to changing climatic conditions for centuries. So this is not the first time that these kinds of things are happening, and we have been able to adapt. African governments are obligated under, the Paris Agreement to tap into this knowledge. However, our knowledge is not really being brought to the table, which is something that must be done. Another proposition would be to at least, have us at the forefront of things. We have more youth in Africa than older generations. So I believe that if we're able to have, the voice, or we're able to be given the grounds to take the lead, I believe that we can get this done in a better way, and we can try to conserve our the insecurities that are happening according to climate change. And another thing about food insecurity, there are different kinds of traditions where I remember back at in our home country, drying food. You know, the food leftover food that is there can be dried and then used to create, like, to make porridge, and it's extremely nutritious, a lot more nutritious than we think. There is also a really cool system that I wish that more countries implemented. So, for example, you see a lot of homeless people outside, and due to the food insecurity and lack of money, these people aren't able to, get a meal every day. There is a system in Niger. I don't know if it's everywhere, but I remember in Niamey, there was this thing where everybody pitched in when it came to giving food. So there are students, we call them al-majribara. These are students who are learners of the faith, and they usually come from the villages, and they don't have much money on them. They don't have money at all on them, and they're not working, they're just students. And these students often go from house to house asking for food. And the one thing within our communities is that every house, at every time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we usually set aside a small portion of our meal so that when these students come, we give them food, and they're able to grab a meal from every single household within that neighborhood or within the community. And I believe this is something that we should implement on a larger scale that would help a lot more when it came to these kinds of things. So instead of wasting food, throwing the food in the trash, we don't believe in that in our culture back in Niger. You don't throw away the food unless it's, completely rotten. If you can't finish it, you give it away. Yeah, that's what we're
I thought
doing.
that was just my mom, but I think it's almost the same here. But
Oh, it's
you never
it's
throw away
everywhere.
food.
Not just with food, but with clothes as well.
Yeah.
Because the clothes industry and the food industry, on an international scale, is impacting climate change in a really horrible way. So food wastage, all of that could be solved if we just shared instead of eating food. I remember in other countries, somebody could just eat one grape out of their entire lunch and throw that all away. Whereas in that same developed country, we have tens and thousands of people who are homeless on the streets with absolutely no food. That doesn't make sense. If they could, if people could implement the things that we're doing on a larger scale globally, that could help with the food insecurity. Another thing is we do that with clothes. There's this other really cool concept that I learned recently called keyhole gardening. And keyhole gardening is something that started, I believe, in the southern African countries in response to food insecurity due to climate change. So keyhole gardening is a type of raised bed gardening that is circular in shape and has a keyhole shape, ident- indentation on one side, and this indentation in the garden bed allows gardeners to add uncooked vegetable scraps, gray water, and manure into a composting basket and sits in the center of the bed. And this way, you can grow any kind of foods and vegetables. So your water wastage, as long as it doesn't have chemicals like soaps, you can throw that in there. Your garbage, you can put that in there. Your manure, you can put that in there, and it's above ground, so you don't actually need soil. And one keyhole garden is enough to feed at least a family of, I think, seven for over 15 years. So that's revolutionary, and it was implemented there in South Africa, and I believe in Soweto. I'm not very sure. You can look it up online. And this method was implemented in across the globe, especially in Europe, and this combated certain things. So for example, when we talked about the how climate change impacts our agriculture, keyhole gardening uh, doesn't take the soil. You don't have to use the soil from the ground that like until it runs out of its nutrition. What it's above the ground, and you have that soil in there, and it doesn't go infertile for a very long time, so you could spend decades using it. And that's revolutionary. I believe that that's one thing that we could use to combat the insecurities, especially food insecurities in Africa, in regards to climate change, since we heavily depend on it.
We've had a few pointers there, I think, when it comes to agriculture, food, food wastage. I actually thought this was just a Kenyan thing, but turns out we don't waste food in the whole continent, which is quite nice. African solutions being given to African problems solved by African people is something I think I have repeated in a different platform. And the youth of Africa are majority of the population, and they're They have this beautiful fire that's in them. I hope we capitalize on that going forward in changing our lives really and our trajectory in terms of even economics and policy and stuff like that. I hope togetherness as well is something that promotes not only culture but also, as we have seen, it actually averts some effects and the problems coming with climate change and food insecurity, which is something major in Africa. I think utilizing indigenous knowledge is something my friend once told me previously, but just on a passing scale. And I think we've discussed this as well with Aisha previously in regards to the older generation on how they know so much and what we're being taught in universities they knew or they were taught by their grandparents. So having to see them exiting the stage and going with all this information not being recorded is something we really need to rethink as the youth, more specifically. And we honestly need to tap into this knowledge that they have because it brings lots of solutions. They have lived on this planet longer and know how to maneuver with not so maybe the novel types of climate change crisis, but the consistent ones like floods and droughts. Actually, I think there was a story. My grandparents, they had to move from where they lived to a different place because there was a long drought, and then it became like a whole city. Like the stories we can learn from these people on how to deal with our problems, and they're found within ourselves and within the older generation and within Africa. All of this, as you mentioned about food and the keyhole garden, I did not know about that. I will look it up for sure. Maybe I also attach a link to it. And as we close, seeing that we're going deep into our time, do you want to talk about food, like African food, briefly? Because I know you can talk for hours about African food. So do you want to talk about African food? And she actually has a whole Instagram page. I don't know what happened on African food.
You know me.
What happened?
Yeah, Aboki
Yeah.
Afro Foods. I've been taking a break.
Yeah, for 2 years.
And I was actually going to delete it due to a lot of things that came up, but I decided to keep it. My sister said to keep it. So I'm preparing to upgrade the content on that.
Oh, wow.
Got quite a few followers when it came to that, and it's amazing. Now, if it comes to African food, I could talk for hours.
So if you want to know African food, I will attach the page she has been updating on African food. And I didn't mention this, but maybe I'm going to give it away as well. Aisha is a podcaster, and she has her own podcast that talks about African experiences. So that's why she was the best fit for this episode. Do you want to still give us something about your podcast?
My podcast is something that I decided to start in order to highlight experiences of me on the African continent. Not just me. I decided to pair up with really cool people from around the continent to do that, and also highlight a lot of the misconceptions that people have. So like you said, Mythbusters, I tried to do that as well. I realized that we, not just when it comes to the world, because I see that we as Africans are so focused on trying to get the world to understand us. They're going to understand us one way or another, as long as we're good on our own. What I really want is that for Africans all over the continent to understand each other and to know each other more. So I've traveled to a couple of countries within the continent, just within West Africa, and I realized how little we know of each other. We barely know anything about each other, and you would be surprised. There are some people who don't even know how many countries we have within the continent, don't know like basic history,
Right.
Folklore, all of these kinds of things that my parents really pushed for me to learn during my childhood, and continue to instill it within me. And I realized that it seems that we're kind of out of touch, not completely, but in some sense, when it comes to each other, we're almost out of touch. And I think that could be remedied by the podcast that I created. So we talk about my personal experiences, and then I also talk with other people about experiences that they have within their own countries, within the African continent, and how we could try to better ourselves.
As I give it a rundown, from the top to the bottom, we talked about today climate change and culture and how they intersect is through conservation, and mostly maybe we dived solely on one key area, which is agriculture and food, which is the main, definition or definer of African culture. So there are a few problems when it comes to how food is not sustainable, or how, some things are not quite easy when it comes to wastage of food or the scarcity of food, as we have seen recently with the droughts. And this is also tied to the episode, I think episode 7 of season 1, if you want to listen to how climate change impacts the agricultural system. So utilizing indigenous knowledge, sharing your food, which is simple. This can even be taught to schools. Share your food. Why would you throw away food? African solutions being given by African people and in African context is something that I really would like to spend more time on, because I have a whole bucket of opinions there going into plenaries and having other people decide what we should do in Africa. So if it's call to action,
Exactly.
Don't waste your food, please. If you can't share your food, if you have your grandparents in your life, could you listen to their stories, please? If you have time, could you listen to Aisha's podcast so you can learn more about Africa, and my podcast so you can learn about climate change? But that's generally it. There are solutions, but they should be given by Africans, to Africans, by Africans. Any last words?
Just to close, like Debbie said, I believe that we can do this on our own terms without being completely influenced by the outside world. We can take, great suggestions from the outside world. However, we must also value the way we do things. For example, when it comes to development, I wish that we as Africans would develop our environment, our countries, to not be centered around concrete culture. So tearing down trees and putting it with pavement. I recently saw that happening at some place, and I was devastated because it doesn't look nice. We can make a place look nice without having to, just tear down all the trees and the bushes. We can develop while simultaneously coexisting with our natural environment. That's something that we should heavily focus on as leaders, as the African youth, and people in general all over the world. I'm glad that Debbie invited me to the podcast to give me insight.
Right. Anyway, so one last point that I forgot is knowing each other. We want Africa to be visa-free. Please hear this, Mr. President, at the AU meeting.
Please.
So
yes.
We want visa-free Africa.
Yes.
I think that's it from our side.
I want to travel to Zanzibar.
I know. Anyway.
Without having to get a visa to get to Tanzania. That's criminal. Come on.
Okay, not you being called out, but thank you for listening. Thank you for taking this flight with us. I hope to see you on the next flight and in Africa maybe. Take care.